Hillsborough remains the UK's worst sporting disaster. It resulted in the unlawful killing of 96 Liverpool fans. In 1990, a decision of accidental death was reached in the initial inquest. Families of the dead and survivors have led a long campaign for justice. But what went wrong at Hillsborough? And is it possible to blame any individual? The deaths at Hillsborough Stadium resulted from a fatal crush during a football match. The FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. In charge on the day was Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, who had never led a match at Hillsborough before. He was put in charge just 19 days before the match. He was unfamiliar with the ground. Mr. Duckenfield lacked the experience of policing big football matches. His predecessor, Chief Superintendent Brian Mole, in contrast had a decade's experience of running football matches at Hillsborough. Mr. Mole had a good physical knowledge of the ground. He also understood the different tactics to employ when the central pens became full. This involved closing the central tunnel and redirecting fans to the adjacent pens when pens 3 and 4 became full. The experienced Mr. Mole did not lead the police at Hillsborough. He was transferred shortly before Hillsborough occurred. This was due to a prank that took place within his team involving a new recruit who was blindfolded, handcuffed and threatened with what he believed was a gun. The police were not transparent about the reason for his transfer for many years. In Mr. Mole's place, the inexperienced Mr. Duckenfield would lead the police presence for the FA Cup semi-final. Mr. Duckenfield's subordinate, Superintendent Roger Marshall, who was also new to policing big matches, was put in charge to control the fans outside the ground. An investigation into the Hillsborough disaster was undertaken by Lord Justice Taylor in April 1989. Taylor put the tragedy down to mismanagement and he was critical of South Yorkshire Police. Years later, in 2012, a further report revealed some shocking conclusions. It was found that 164 witness statements had been altered, and of those statements, 116 were amended to remove or change negative comments about South Yorkshire Police. The independent panel concluded that the main cause of the disaster was a lack of police control and that crowd safety was compromised at every level. The panel also concluded that up to 41 of the 96 who perished might have survived had the emergency services coordination been more robust. On the match day, all Liverpool fans were to enter the north and west stands via Leppings Lane. The crush occurred in the west stand, the entrance to which 10,100 Liverpool fans were expected to navigate through just 7 turnstiles. At 2 o'clock there were 2,140 fans in the pens. The entrance to the pens was via the central tunnel. In previous games when the central pens became overcrowded, police would close the central tunnel in response, directing fans to the adjacent pens. This was known informally at the ground as the Freeman tactic after a former police officer. At 2:15, the crowds outside the entrance were growing. Crush developed outside the entrance as all Liverpool fans were funneled through what was effectively a single bottleneck, Leppings Lane. Inside the ground, the central pens were becoming dangerously overcrowded. Overseen by the observation tower, Mr. Duckenfield would have been able to see the overcrowding developing. David Duckenfield acknowledged in the 2014 inquest that the failure to close the central tunnel was the direct cause of the 96 deaths at Hillsborough. He said in so many words under questioning that he froze and was unaware of the action to take as the pens filled up to dangerous levels. During the 2014 inquest, Mr. Duckenfield's subordinate Mr. Marshall also noted his regret on not asking for the 3 PM kickoff to be delayed, something that was fairly common practice at the time. Mr. Marshall radioed the control box to ask for Gate C to be opened to stop the crush outside the ground. After asking 3 times at 2:52 PM, Gate C was finally opened after permission was granted from the control tower. When Gate C was finally opened, fans rushed in, heading straight for the central tunnel. Eyewitness accounts noted that the force of the crowd rushing in through Gate C was so huge they were literally lifted off the ground and carried towards the pens. It was impossible for anyone in that crowd to stop and turn back. Kickoff was now around 5 minutes away as fans began dying through asphyxiation. The perimeter gates at the fronts of the pens began to spring open from the force of the crowd pressing against them in the pens. Some fans began climbing the fences and rear walls to escape the crush. Police were slow to act, and some tried to close the pen doors, Some police officers even tried to stop fans climbing out of the pens. Eventually, the police started to understand the gravity of the situation, so they started to open the perimeter gates, allowing fans onto the pitch. Emergency teams, police and fans then began working together to help the injured and dying. The first ambulance was on the pitch at 3:15 p.m. Access for further emergency vehicles was troublesome. Some only made it onto the ground over an hour later. The earliest safety assessments made by safety engineers commissioned in 1978 made it very apparent that the stadium failed to meet minimum safety standards as defined in the Safety of Sports Grounds Act 1975, and this included emergency access. Looking back now, it's easy to see how unsuitable the ground was, but the match was to go ahead at Hillsborough regardless. It also cannot be denied that there was a major issue around football hooliganism in the UK at that time. The Football Association had banned British clubs from playing in Europe following on from the Heysel Stadium tragedy in 1985. That ban was still in force at the time of Hillsborough. Mr. Duckenfield saw football hooligans as a major safety threat to effective crowd control. His lack of knowledge of the ground and safety procedures may have blinded him to the real dangers of overcrowding. Also at that time, many held the belief that Liverpool fans caused trouble at football matches. On reading the investigations, it is clear that many factors came together in a tragic way, leading to the deaths of so many football fans. The poor planning, inadequate crowd control, and poor crisis management of those in charge are undeniable. Amended police statements that hid certain facts didn't seem to influence Lord Justice Taylor's damning conclusions of the South Yorkshire Police Force's mismanagement. In light of the report, the initial inquest in 1990 still ruled that the deaths were accidental, however. One final, perhaps little known fact is that a similar tragedy almost occurred at the same ground in very similar circumstances just 7 years prior to the Hillsborough disaster. In 1981, before the FA Cup final between Tottenham Hotspur and Wolves, there was congestion at the Leppings Lane turnstiles resulting in crushing in the outer concourse. Again, this resulted in the opening of exit gate C to relieve the crush. During this match, however, fans were able to escape onto the pitch. At the second inquest in 2014, Mr. Duckenfield admitted he had been unaware of the crushing at this match in 1981, and in the longest trial in British legal history, in 2019, Mr. Duckenfield was found not guilty of gross negligence manslaughter. Mr. Duckenfield cannot be tried again on the charges unless there is new and compelling evidence. It would be interesting to hear opinions in the comments section on whether this was the right decision. Happily, following the Hillsborough disaster, there has been a deep impact on safety standards. Football will never be the same again.